Some of you may recognize me because I was with you back in April doing my 5 steps to structure and get a book together. And you asked me back, so that's good. So I'm guessing that it wasn't a complete disaster. So it's lovely to be back with you again. And today is the first of those 3 masterclasses taking you through the process in a bit more detail. We're focusing today on story. And I will try to come in well within the hour, so there'll be lots of time for questions afterwards. So do put your questions in the chat, or keep a note of them as we go through, and there should be lots of time at the end for doing that. But before I go any further, and just for those who weren't, there we go. Sorry, I can't advance my slide. Let me just quickly introduce myself. So hello, I'm Alison Jones. I have been in the book business for over 25 years now, embarrassingly. I started as an author and as a bookseller, which of course are the 2 pointy ends of publishing. And I worked as an editor with Chambers in Edinburgh, and then Oxford University Press, and then most recently Palgrave Macmillan in traditional publishing. And I spearheaded digital publishing. I took Macmillan's professional and academic book content online. But as the world was changing in the early thousands, I could see that publishing needed to change too, and it wasn't. So self-publishing was becoming a thing, and I could see so many good people writing such awful books with really bad production values. And I could also see traditional publishers becoming more and more risk-averse and more fearful of this new world, which seemed to me like a great opportunity. So in 2014, I left my role as Director of Innovation Strategy at Macmillan, and I set up my own business, Practical Inspiration Publishing, working as a publishing partner to help business leaders get clear on their message and create beautiful, powerful, helpful books. And what really energizes me and what inspires me is helping people who have got something to say discover the power of writing to shape and deepen their thinking, and then help them build really, really good books that are deeply integrated with their business strategy and their content strategy. And I would say I am powered by ideas and curiosity and connection and peanut butter, mostly peanut butter. So this is the 3-stage model, if you like, that we're going to be going through over the next few weeks: story, strategy, and system. They are so closely interrelated, and I did agonize a little bit over which one I was going to start with, either strategy or story. But I decided that I would start with story, because I know that when most people reach out to me, the thing that's uppermost in their mind is what's my book about? So that's where we're going to start today. But we're going to start not just with what your book's about, but with your broader story. And I think that story is a word that's very overused these days. So just to be clear, I am not talking about an Instagram story or a Facebook story. I'm not even talking about a case study or an advertising campaign, although these can be really, really powerful uses of storytelling in business. And you will use stories, these micro stories in your book. And being a good storyteller and a visual storyteller as well is a really, really useful skill. But today I'm talking, as I say, about that bigger story. I'm going to call it the macro story. And it was really fascinating hearing Zora in the introduction there talking about the Rising Networks story and bringing out so much of it there, and doing that really, really well. Because what the macro story does is set out who you really are. You know, your values, your vision, your passions, where you come from and where you're going, and why you do what you do. And the sort of the shape of the distinctive dent that you want to make in the universe. And all the micro stories that you tell in your talks and your blog and your book, all of those come out of this big story. And once you're clear on that, it is the frame for everything, including your book. So this isn't easy. If it was easy, everybody would be doing it, and they're not. So we're going to take a look at 3 fundamental truths about that big story. Your story makes sense of you. Your story's bigger than you, and your story isn't finished yet. So let's jump in with that first one. Your story makes sense of you. So you are a unique bundle of experiences and skills and preferences and fears and ambitions, and you get to choose the narrative that you tell yourself and the world about that unique mix. And that is incredibly powerful. And this is why successful companies are so proud of and curate so carefully their origin stories, their key decision moments, their response to crisis, and really interesting the storytelling that's been going on recently, because these are the things that reveal who they really are. I don't know if you noticed when I shared my story at the start, even though it's very, very short, I didn't just give you an overview of my CV and credentials. I tried to share with you what really matters to me, where I've come from, what drives me. And, and that macro story plays out in lots of different ways. It's the story behind my first book, This Book Means Business, which is a sort of practical guide to writing a book that works harder for your business. And it's also behind the story behind the book that I'm writing at the moment, which is doesn't have a title yet, but it's all about how you can use writing as a thinking tool to do better business. That macro story is the story that tells me who I am, and it tells other people whether I'm the kind of person that they want to connect with. And if they share the same values and vision, then they will feel that. I love this quote. I mean, we're all very aware of the Simon Sinek "start with why," and it's a sort of truism of business now, and quite rightly so. It's very, very powerful. But I love this quote by Bernadette Jiwa. You know, what matters to people is not how you show up, but why you show up. And when people understand what drives you, when they have an emotional response to that, that's really powerful. And I think, you know, there's a world of difference between somebody who sets up a publishing house because they've sniffed the opportunity to make some money from gullible would-be authors, and someone who's been passionate about books their entire life, who's been innovating in publishing, who's been opening up access to ideas throughout her career, someone who's evangelical about helping other people discover the power of writing. I very much hope that people feel that's the power of my story. So think about what you do. Think about how that taps into your deepest values, and how it's emerged from your life experience. Because if you can communicate that, you can connect with people who share those values, and want to work with someone who not only knows their stuff, but cares really deeply about it. And the second truth is that your story is bigger than you. And this is the magical paradox about stories. It's actually the magical paradox about human beings. You know, we're all unique, and yet we're all the same. And discovering your own story, that's a really deeply personal process. But the effect is that it connects you more authentically to other people. And if you think about the earliest stories that we told each other, our creation myths, you know, it's still the foundation of the most powerful stories that we tell each other today. They are about who we are, not who I am. They set out the shared values and the common origins, and they offer answers to the big questions that other people can buy into. And if you forget that commonality, if you forget the fact that it's bigger than you, you can become quite a selfish exercise telling your story. Your story isn't actually just about you. So don't get lost in the specific details of your CV. Find the themes and the moments of drama that will speak to other people too. And you're probably familiar with the hero's journey, which is developed by Joseph Campbell. It's a classic story cycle, which is, it underpins the great classical epics, Star Wars, Frozen, you know, so many of the stories that are so culturally resonant to us. Just to give you a very quick overview of it, the hero leaves the ordinary world following some call to adventure. They go on a quest into unknown territory where they meet a mentor. They face a series of trials or tests, culminates in a climactic ordeal from which they emerge successful, although it looks like they're going to fail, and they return to a new normal, a changed person. So it doesn't really do justice to it. It's a very, very powerful model, but that's it in a nutshell. And if I asked you to tell me your story, you'd probably give me a kind of version of the hero's journey where you're the hero and you tell me about where you came from, the ordeals you've faced, and the successes that you've had. And that's great. You know, those are really, really useful things to have. But from a business perspective, one of the most valuable lessons I have ever learned from a business book, and that's saying a lot, was from a brilliant book by Donald Miller called How to Build Building a Story Brand. And this is a quote from Donald Miller. And the point that really resonated with me was when he said, do not position yourself as the hero in your own story. Very counterintuitive. But his point is that in your potential customer's mind, for which read in your reader's mind as you're writing a book, they're the hero of their own story, and they're facing their own quest, their own trials, they're pursuing their own idea of success. And heroes are not out looking for other heroes to compete with. Heroes are out looking for guides to help them. And that's really powerful. So when you're telling your story, instead of considering yourself as Luke Skywalker, think of yourself more as Yoda. Miller says a guide has got two vital elements: empathy and a plan. And both of those are really important. So if you tell me that you have struggled with what I'm struggling with, when you show me that you really understand what I'm going through, that you care about what I care about, you're demonstrating empathy, and that's fantastic. But you can't just leave it there. You also have to show me that you have a plan that worked for you, that you can show work for you, and that can work for me. And when you've got those two things together, that is really, really powerful. And then the last point in those three, your story isn't finished yet. And I think this is really important and really hopeful, and too many people forget it. It is very easy to get stuck in our stories, for our stories to kind of define us in an unhelpful way if we let them. Until they write your obituary, your story isn't finished. Your fundamental values probably won't change. There will be things that remain constant all your life, but you are continually learning and making new connections and seeing new opportunities and understanding the world differently. And you need to make space for that in your story. You're not dead yet. You know, it's okay to change your mind. And in fact, changing your mind, getting a new perspective, seeing things differently, these can be really important points in the story that you then go on to tell too. So don't get stuck in your story. And I love this quote by Salman Rushdie, one of the world's great storytellers. It reminds me, you know, those who don't have power over the story that dominates their lives, the power to retell it, rethink it, deconstruct it, joke about it, and change it as times change, truly are powerless because they can't think new thoughts. And I think that quote reminds me that I am not my story. My story is a construct that I created to make sense of what I've experienced and what I feel to be true. But my story can grow with me. And when I started out with Practical Inspiration, I had no idea actually how powerful it was going to be, helping business leaders discover the power of writing as a thinking tool. And now that's a key part of my story. And it's also the topic of my next book. And so I want to come on to this now. How does this macro story relate to your book? So if you're writing a biography, then clearly your story is your book. But unless you're already famous, or you have a truly outstanding story which involves superhuman challenges, or you can write like an angel, and ideally all three, you probably shouldn't be writing a biography because nobody cares. And I'm sorry, that sounds really brutal and really harsh, but actually remember what I said about the hero's journey? You know, the heroes in their own stories, they're not out looking for other heroes. They want guides. Why should they care about your story? And they're really interested in their own journey. And they're only interested in your journey insofar as it can help them on their own journey in some way. So that doesn't mean that you can't tell your own story in your own book. In fact, you kind of have to. Remember that piece about empathy? The best books are personal, and the author makes themselves vulnerable, and they build trust with the reader. You know, they demonstrate empathy. But it does mean that although you can weave your story through your book isn't primarily about you, it's about your reader. And when you're writing a business book, then generally your reader is your customer, and that's pretty damn exciting in itself. So this Venn diagram is a useful tool to help you frame that thinking. And as this is hard, you know, this is not easy stuff. But if you see your book lying at the intersection of your story and your customer's story and the context, so your story we've just talked about, your customer's story, you know, what are they facing? What is the prize that they're seeking? What are the trials that they're up against? And then that wider context is about, well, what's going on in the world that can help them better understand and better respond to the stuff that they're facing. If you can find the sweet spot in the middle of those three, then you're onto an absolute winner. So just to demonstrate, Donald Miller, for example, because I've just been talking about StoryBrand, which I think is a great example of a book that's embedded in a business. Donald Miller uses his own story, his own experience in marketing, his own aha moments about storytelling, and he ties that in with his readers' frustration about their own failed marketing efforts. And he puts the whole thing into the context of the established framework of the hero's journey, but also the bigger picture of a changing marketing environment in digital marketing. And out of those three elements, out of the intersection of them, he creates his own plan, his own distinctive intellectual property, StoryBrand. It's brilliant. But this is hard, it matters, and it takes time. So if you can't sit down today and do this job, that's fine, because the writing can help you. it's probably a good sign, actually, if you can't immediately say, this is the book I'm going to write. I'm always quite suspicious when people get really, quick, I'm going to start here, because it generally means that they're starting with their own story and they haven't done that work that isn't intuitive about thinking through where other people are coming from. So start from your own story, but then get clear on that, but then get curious about your customers' needs and their own experience and their pains and frustrations and their ambitions. And also think intelligently and curiously about the world that we're in, and read widely and look at the direction of travel. And as I say, the great news is that writing is a brilliant tool to help with all of this. And I think most people's conception of writing is too narrow. They think that business writing is all about the finished product, the book, the sales copy, the report, whatever. So if you're thinking in that paradigm, you have to do your thinking and get clear on your ideas before you're ready to write the report, the book, whatever. Have you ever heard that famous trope about the Inuits having 50 words for snow, which apparently is actually true? Writing, I think, is a bit like that as well. There's lots of different sorts of writing. So I'm going to try and expand your view of it today, because some of those are really perfect tools for helping you on this journey and helping you get clear about your thinking. So this is my taxonomy of different kind of writing environments. It's a 2x2 matrix because I think that's always a really helpful way of organizing ideas. I just love a 2x2 matrix. And in this matrix, the axes are clarity, so more clarity versus less clarity, and also the direction of focus, whether it's internal or external. And you can see on that internal external axis, you go from at the far end of internal is just yourself, at the far end of external it's the world, but there's actually quite a lot of gradation along there as well. So it might involve working across that line, a trusted friend, a team, a company, partners and customers, all the way along that line, through stakeholders to everybody who doesn't even know you yet. And in those quadrants, you can see in that bottom left one, when your clarity is low and it's really internally focused, it's about exploration. It's very fluid and uncertain down here. You have kind of a sense of something, but you can't quite articulate it yet. You don't even know if it really matters yet. You're not sure what it means. And then as you get clearer, you move up into the expand quadrant. You're still focusing internally. You start to expand your thinking, you clarify your idea, you get a sense of its implications and the boundaries of it as well. We're going to come on to talk about scope in a little while. Bottom right, if you are still unclear, but you're more externally focused, then you're in what I call the engagement space. You're researching, you're getting feedback, you're asking questions, you're experimenting. And then finally, there's a sort of direction of travel up to that top right quadrant there. Once you have clarity and once you're focused on external communication, then you're in expressive mode. And this is where you're convincing, you're persuading people with a clear, compelling story. So how does that framework pan out in writing? Well, these are just a few of the tools that you can use at each stage. When you're in that exploration stage, free writing is just one of the most valuable tools you can have. It's so powerful, and it's one of the things I most enjoy teaching people, because we aren't taught this at school. I just genuinely don't know why. You set a timer, you give yourself a prompt, which can be a question, for example, and you just write whatever comes into your head about that topic for 5 minutes, 10 minutes. Don't do it more than that, however long you've set the timer for. And it's raw and it's messy, and you repeat yourself and you start going off in tangents and then drawing yourself back. And that's fine, because this is writing that is just for you. And it's just about creating that space and using the writing to kind of unspool your thoughts. If you're thinking about something, you go around in circles and you can't keep track of it. If you're writing, it allows you to just sort of draw out the golden thread. And always by halfway through the second page, you hit gold. It's amazing. So that's a really powerful tool. Other tools include mind mapping, which you're probably familiar with, journaling, taking notes as you research, as you write, as you hear conversations, hear things on the television maybe, formulating questions. Even the act of formulating question is a great route to clarity, which you can then obviously take into the engage phase and ask people, or you can do another free writing sprint on. When you're in the expand quadrant, this is where you start to put things into words in a more organized way. So maybe you're drafting an article or a blog, or you're creating a working table of contents for your book, which you're going to come on to in a minute, maybe you're drawing a picture of the model that you're putting together and how that might work as a diagram, because that's a really powerful way of communicating. And all of those processes will help you understand your ideas better and prepare you to communicate them to other people. When you're focused on engaging, you can still write, even though this is obviously talking to other people and you have a fairly low level of clarity. You know, framing questions for people to use in surveys or focus groups, taking notes as people talk. These are really, really powerful tools. And you can, of course, try out early drafts or title ideas or marketing copy on beta readers. And then finally, in that express quadrant, this is the stuff that we're most familiar with as business writing. This is when we're clear on what we're saying, we're ready to get it out into the world. And the ability to write well here really, really comes into its own. It's such a key business skill, because you're storytelling, you're presenting, you're pitching, you're writing a book. And it's working and it's landing because you've been through those other stages and you've used those other forms of writing to get really, really clear on what you're saying. And I just wanted to touch on 3 dimensions of the story that relate specifically to writing a book: structure, scope, and style. And I'd say that most of the editorial coaching that I do is focused on one or more of these. So if you can keep these in your mind through that process of exploring, expanding, engaging, and expressing, then you'll find it much easier to write your book, and it'll be a much better book at the end of the day. So firstly, structure, how you organize your ideas. And I did talk about this a little bit in the first session. If you're there, you might recognize that picture. But I don't make any apologies for talking about it again, because it's so fundamental to the success of a book particularly, and your ability to write the damn thing too. You know, you might get away without structure for a blog, but a book is a long form piece of writing. And if you haven't got a structure, you're probably just going to grind to a halt if you just start writing on page 1. So when we're thinking about structure, we're thinking, well, what are the key elements of the idea that I'm expressing here, and how do they fit together? And this is where drawing a picture can be really, really helpful, because it forces you into a level of clarity about how the different elements fit together. So we've talked about mind maps, very primitive kind of picture. I've shown you a simple 2x2 matrix. You know, both of those are great examples of tools that you can use, visual tools you can use to help organize your ideas. And another tool that I really encourage people to create if they're creating a book is a working table of contents. It's not just the list of chapter headings. It's not as simple as the table of contents you see in the finished book. This is a writer's tool. This shows you the subheadings below each chapter heading. And if you're going to do it really properly, you can actually go down to the level of, you know, what is the key point in each paragraph of this book? So if you can create the skeleton of your book like that, maybe using Post-it notes, maybe using Trello board, you know, lots of people use different ways of doing it, mind mapping software. And if you have that together with the overall extent for the book, and you can break that down into roughly how long each section is going to be, you have everything you need. Once you have that, you can just start writing. And you don't have to waste time worrying about whether you're writing the right thing, or where this is going to go, or maybe it should be earlier, or are you repeating yourself? You can just get on with it. And if you know roughly how long that section is going to be, then you know when it's done. And never, ever underestimate the power of knowing when you're finished. It's really important. And then the scope, you know, where do you draw the line? What's in and what's out? What goes on the plate and what stays off it? Because scope is very, very closely related to structure, because it's about, you know, where you stop and what's in and what's out. And so many first-time authors make the mistake of trying to cram as much as they possibly can, everything they know, into their first book. And they feel like that's serving the reader. And of course it's not. It's like having a plate that's just, you know, filled to overflowing. Where do you start? It's just overfacing. If you put too much in your book, the book will kind of collapse under the weight of it, and so will the reader. So less is more. You know, the reader is relying on you to do the filtering for them, as well as telling them stuff. It's all about what you leave out. And the space on the page, the space that you give the reader to process the ideas, just as important as the ideas that you give them. I always say to people as well, when you're writing a business book, think about how the structure is going to work. And this white space on the page, it's like music, you know, that the pauses are just as important as the notes themselves. And then the last aspect to bear in mind is style. And you have so much more control over this than you think. I think often people just write in quite an unself-conscious, unthinking way. And it's fine, it might work. But actually, if you just get a bit more conscious about how you present yourself, then you can go from good to great. So I do an exercise in the This Book Means Business Bootcamp where I get people to write a section as they normally would without agonizing over it too much. And then they have fun. They consciously, they pick a personality word like whimsical or playful or authoritative or challenging or controversial. And then they rewrite that section explicitly trying to convey that tone. And it's a really great way of developing your confidence in your ability to write and be more intentional about how you write. And think about the personality that you're expressing. The picture I've used here is one of our authors called Lucy Werner, who some of you may know. She wrote a book called Hype Yourself. And she's such a great example of somebody who has a real clear visual style and personality. And her book absolutely reflects that. It's no nonsense, it's accessible, it's original. And she knows that that's part of her brand story that comes across through everything she does. So thinking about how you present yourself visually, but also how you write to reflect that is really important. And as I say, you might not have thought about it before, but if you experiment with different ways of doing it, you'll soon discover that you can be really distinctive. And that's it for this first session for the story part in terms of the formal presentation. Next session, we're going to talk about strategy and how you make your book work for your business specifically. There's some really interesting tools for that. But for now, it's over to you.